Tunisia's Nobel Peace Prize success. Civil society groups have been rewarded for steering the country from the brink of chaos to democracy after the upheaval of the Arab Spring. So can Tunisia be an inspiration to others in a region in turmoil? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, few people outside Tunisia will have known about the National Dialogue Quartet before now. It's been thrust onto the world stage by winning the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, the Nobel Committee said the group of labour unions, employers, lawyers and human rights activists helped pull the country back from the brink of civil war. It stepped in at a time of real crisis and quietly but efficiently resolved differences between Tunisia's rival factions, those who wanted the country governed by religious principles and those who did not. Now, Tunisia has a stable government and is being held up as an example to others. The message from the Nobel Committee: it's good to talk. Well, in late 2013, Tunisia was on a knife edge 2 years after the overthrow of longtime President Zine Ben Ali. Opposition leaders had been shot dead. There was unrest on the streets and calls for the government to resign. Well, that's when this year's Nobel Prize winner, the National Dialogue Quartet, was first formed. By December, they'd helped the religious Ennahda party and mainly secular opposition agree on an interim government. And the quartet was instrumental in the new constitution, ratified in January last year. Just a few months later, the state of emergency imposed in 2011 was lifted. And last October, elections were held that produced the current government, overseen by an electoral commission created by the quartet. All right, let's bring in our guests now. From Geneva, we have Christopher Thornton from the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue. He was in Tunisia during this whole dialogue process. And in Tunis, we have Nicholas No, who's editor-in-chief of MideastWire.com. Welcome to you both. And Nicholas, let me start with you in Tunis. So this was clearly a potent collaboration of 4 separate civil society groups coming together and showing the power of civil society.
It was a potent combination, and it certainly played an important role in expediting a political settlement in this country. But we should remember, especially today, especially if the Nobel Committee is designing this award to praise and to single out Islamist and secularist cooperation, that the key roles were played by the actual political parties on the ground, the democratically elected members of parliament from all different sides, not primarily the 4 non-governmental organizations that represent a small part of this country.
But surely the heavy lifting...
Both
but Nicholas,
the secularist parties, and there are very many...
The heavy lifting was done by the facilitators, surely.
I disagree completely. The hard decisions that were made in the streets, on the ground, in the negotiation back rooms, and in public, transparently in Parliament, the votes that were taken for and against at critical moments, these were made by the political parties, the democratically elected government people, not by the NGOs. The NGOs played an important role in facilitation, but also one could draw that out for some criticism as well, as indeed some Tunisians and some analysts have over this last 2 years, because what you had was a quasi-democratic, extra-parliamentary process, not elected by anyone, that facilitated a very difficult moment of transition in this country. Now, some have argued, and I believe there's a certain measure of argument that's correct here, that that was the beginning of a process that paved the way for the resurgence of many of the anti-democratic forces that ruled this country for quite some time and that arguably have seen a strong comeback in the last 6 months to a year in this country. Now, I believe that certainly Tunisia should be praised. Certainly it should be praised. But I wonder if the Nobel Committee in singling out these 4 actors, I wonder if they're the right actors to single out. Did they have to make the hard decisions? Did they have to decide to vote against a majority of their constituents on the ground? Did they have to make compromises? Not necessarily. It was really the political actors. And again, political actors on all sides.
All right, let's put that then to Christopher in Geneva. Christopher, do you think that the work of the quartet and the quartet itself is deserving of this Nobel Peace Prize?
I think that the work of the quartet is absolutely deserving, and I don't think we should try to undermine the achievement made by the quartet and by the national dialogue process. I see where Nicola is coming from. I mean, in every mediation process, it's the parties to the conflict, it's the parties to the crisis that need to make the compromises, that need to sell those compromises back to their constituencies. But still, if we remember the context in Tunisia at that period, it was an extremely difficult context. Political polarization was at an all-time high. There were protests in the streets. These events were taking place in the wake of political assassinations. So merely being able to bring the parties together, I think, was a tremendous achievement on the part of the quartet, and I think that it's right that they should be credited for that. And
Nicholas, you've talked of the very difficult decisions that had to be taken by the political parties and the politicians involved. Fundamentally, the compromise, I suppose, is the fundamental essence of what was brokered by the quartet. Tell us about the compromises, more about the compromises that were actually forged by the work of the quartet.
Well, without getting into too much of the details, there are 2 major things that I think your viewers should know about. One is that the majority coalition government at the time in 2013, throughout the process of the quartet dialogue and then into early 2014, it voluntarily gave up power. It was led by the Islamist Nahda party, but it included in that so-called Troika government also secular and leftist parties as well. And that coalition, that original coalition, voluntarily gave up power after passing the new constitution and agreeing on upcoming elections. That's a very important compromise for anyone to make in the whole world, to voluntarily give up the reins of power after you've been democratically elected to hold them. That's one. There was also a historic vote that took place, which essentially ended up blocking an attempt by some, especially in the Nahda Islamist Party, to exclude certain political actors that had been a part of the ex-regime, the dictatorship that ruled this country, and quite in many difficult ways, quite violently. The decision was made by one vote against excluding members of the former regime. Tunisia has a president that was formerly a part of the Ben Ali regime. He would have been excluded from running in future elections. That effort was stopped in part because the head of Nahda, Rashid Ghannouchi, convinced enough of his members and others in the coalition to block that effort because he believed that that was something that would undermine democracy. And of course, there was a certain amount of political interest as well. But those are 2 critical votes that were tough for folks to make, tough for people on all sides of the issues to make. Also, I would single out some of the people that are now in the ruling party, let's say, in Nida Tunis at that time. The decision to not follow along in the Egyptian model, where you have essentially a coup d'etat. Nida Tunis also should be commended in certain degrees, and some of their key actors, in not forcing too much the street actions, the protests, to circumvent the democratic process of this country. Those are some of the actors that I would argue we should at least consider ahead of the actual 4 NGOs that were ostensibly convening this kind of dialogue. I think if you ask a lot of Tunisians today, they'll be a lot of pride, and I've already seen that in the last few hours from friends and colleagues and associates.
That's a very good point, Nicholas.
But this is not an
unambiguous thing. It's a really good point that I want to actually put to Christopher from the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue, because the difficulty that Nicholas has described of this process of reaching the kind of compromise that's led to a stable government in Tunisia today is essentially homegrown. This speaks to the power, doesn't it, of homegrown mediation and negotiation.
Absolutely. I think this is one example where you can say insider mediation, mediation by Tunisian actors has been highly successful. And I think that is partly because of the historic ties, the historic roots of the organizations that were running this dialogue process, and also because of their strong base and strong constituencies. I mean, the UGTT, the trade union, is an organization which has between 700 and 800,000 members, so a very strong constituency. The Tunisian League for Human Rights has been doing tremendous work over a very long period of time. The Employers Association, which represents major interests.
Effectively, you're talking yourself out of a job, aren't you, Christopher? What role then for outsiders like you, the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue, the United Nations, the rest of them? Why do you need to get involved, if at all?
I think that Tunisia is a particular case, and we can't necessarily extrapolate out from the situation in Tunisia to other situations. Tunisia has been blessed with a very strong civil society, as I said. It's also been blessed with high-caliber politicians who are willing to make difficult choices and sell those choices to their electorates, and generally with a population which abhors violence and likes to seek compromise and find consensus. So I think Tunisia is a unique case where it was appropriate for insider actors to play a mediation role.
Well,
that might not work in other contexts.
Absolutely. Nicholas, so Tunisia, we've highlighted the positive, haven't we? But it's still very much a work in progress, isn't it? We've seen at least 2 violent attacks which have shaken Tunisia to the core, most especially, of course, its tourism industry, upon which it relies heavily.
Absolutely. I mean, this is another potential problem or criticism of today's announcement by the Nobel Committee in awarding the quartet, specifically the quartet, the Nobel Peace Prize, because actually 2 years on from the quartet's work, what we've seen actually is 2 things. Tunisia has become actually more fragile. Indeed, the president of this country recently let it slip or said that there was the possibility that Tunisia could be a failed state, especially if there's another terrorist attack. That's extremely worrying. And that, I think, should lead us to try to understand why is it that after dramatically and heroically succeeding in writing a new constitution, in having elections, why is it that this state actually is at such a fragile point in its democratic transition? Indeed, I'm scared because all that the Nobel Committee awarded today, its reasons for awarding it, I think that there are some analysts here, and I'm included, that believe those achievements could be swept away quite quickly, in fact.
Can we just hold that thought?
The whole country
Nicholas,
is very
can I
much
ask you to hold that
there
thought
could be another attack.
Just for a moment, because at this point it would be quite useful for us to look a little bit more closely at those attacks to which Nicholas was referring. Now, in March, gunmen killed 22 people at the Bardo Museum in Tunis. Many were tourists. 3 months later, more tourists were killed when a gunman opened fire at a beach resort. 38 people were shot dead. The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, claimed responsibility. The UN says 5,500 Tunisians have joined ISIL. The Tunisian government has responded with a security crackdown, which rights groups describe as draconian. The new measures include phone tapping and extended detention without access to a lawyer. Right, we can bring in Amina Zena now, a journalist for Tunisia National Radio, who's been covering the work of the quartet in depth, and she's also in Tunis. Now, Amina, Nicholas, who I'm sure you know, suggests that the Nobel Peace Prize would have been better or more appropriate going to the politicians involved who had to make such difficult decisions of compromise, the politicians of Ennahda Party and of Nida Tunis, to mention just 2 parties. What do you think? Do you think the quartet is deserving of this Peace Prize?
I think that the quartet just achieved a very difficult accomplishment by gathering all these political parties to the table of negotiation in 2013 and 2014. It was such a difficult accomplishment to do, and in a time that Tunisia were living just after political assassinations. This was the Tunisian society was wondering about its political process, its democratic and transitional process, where it will be finished with elections and with a new government democratically established, or it will be accomplished by another political assassinations or civil war maybe. This was the role and the mission of the quartet. They interfered in a time that all the world was looking to Tunisia.
Okay.
What will it do
all
in
right.
a time of political assassination?
We've now heard quite a lot of praise for the success of the work of the quartet. Essentially, how do you think they did it? What was the key to their success of managing to get these rival parties to sit around the table and then to make these huge compromises?
It was all the political party and the other components of the civil society, the Tunisian civil society, were aware of that if they will complete their, if they carry on this difficulties, if Harkat al-Nahda's party will say this, I'm in the government with a legitimate way and I will not give it up. And in this time of social unrest and this civil war was threatening Tunisia, and all the political parties were aware of that. That's why when the quartet called them to come to the table of negotiation, no one refused. Every one of them came, and they said maybe consensuous decisions will be better than civil war, and this is what they did, and this is why the quartet succeeded. And in addition to that, the organizations, the four organizations of the quartet, were having a good. They were very powerful in the Tunisian society. You know, the union,
okay.
the General Union
all
of
right.
Labour.
Yes, we've heard about the strength of civil society in Tunisia. Nicholas, can I go to you in Tunis again and ask you if Tunisia is such a model of success? It certainly is within the region and is touted as the only success story in the Arab Spring phenomenon. Why do Tunisians constitute the largest nationality comprising ISIL?
It's a very good question, and I think that goes to the need to be critical of this narrative that it is unambiguously the only success story in the Arab revolts. I mean, the context of the Arab revolts has been pretty bad so far, so that might not even be saying so much. But that is a very, very good point that a lot of analysts and some Tunisians also make. I would say that that really highlights the core problem here, which is why is it that after successfully writing a constitution and democratic elections, why do we have a country where the president of the country recently said that this could be a failed state, that it could collapse? I think that that partially is related to what we've seen in the last 2 years, and indeed since the quartet's activity in 2013, which I think has to be critically examined. Why is it that we see some Tunisians and some outside analysts arguing that the deep state, the parallel state here of the security sector, the cops essentially, some business elites, and the mafia are increasingly gaining back some of the powers that they lost after the revolution? Is that parallel state, which is now arguably resurgent amidst this democratic transition, is that going to be able to protect this country? Will that parallel state help the economic reform process? Will it help the security sector process and address all of those issues which you recently laid out that human rights groups have been criticizing? I think there should be great concern that Tunisia is at a very dangerous moment. It is not on the right track right now. and that partially is a result of the extra-parliamentary and in some ways very quasi-democratic movements that happened over the last year or two, instead of being through the parliament and through the legitimate political party.
Christopher,
I just think that's something that we need to question.
All right, thank you for that point. Christopher, in Geneva, we're talking about a broad church, aren't we? We're talking about an umbrella coalition that has been criticised by some for involving members of the old guard, those who held positions of power under the dictatorship of Ben Ali, retaining positions in the new Tunisia. Is this necessarily a strength of the new Tunisia, or could this be the chink in its armour, the beginning of its undoing?
I think I would echo some of the points made by Nicola about some of the structural problems within the Tunisian state and the Tunisian society, and the tremendous threats which Tunisia is facing, both in terms of terrorism, but also in terms of economic and social problems. But I think that this is a reason to applaud the efforts made by the quartet, rather than a reason to undermine the efforts made by the quartet. I think that the quartet's initiative to make a broader consensus and a more inclusive political process is one of the key elements which led to the success of the 2014 elections, and such an approach, such an inclusive approach, will be the way in which Tunisia will be able to manage some of these challenges which it faces today.
Amina, in Tunis, do you think that the quartet, or the mechanism that has been established by the quartet, do you think that this will endure? Is this something that will remain in Tunisian life?
I think that it will remain in the Tunisian political life because many reasons. The first, that the role of the quartet during the two previous I mean 2013 and 2014, their role, it was a historical role. That's why every time Tunisia witnesses a crisis, a political crisis, will ask for the quartet to interfere and to give their, to search and to reach consensus and compromise between the political parties in Tunisia.
And Christopher, is this a model then that can be replicated elsewhere?
Well?
Oh, yeah, please do.
I would agree with Amina that the quartet kind of cemented a Tunisian model of consensus building, and that model is not going to go away. But I think that we shouldn't also forget that there are other actors who have played a role, such a role in Tunisia, and probably will play such a role in the future. Now, those include both domestic actors. We shouldn't forget the tremendous work done by Mustafa Ben Jafar, the president of the Constituent Assembly, in shepherding the constitutional process to its conclusion. We shouldn't forget the dialogue efforts made by the presidency under President Marzouki, and also the tremendous efforts highlighted by Nicola of Rasha Ghannouchi and Beji Qaid Sebsi to bridge that divide between secularists and Islamists.
Nicholas, I'll give the final minute to you then, and it is just a minute, please. I'm just wondering whether the Tunisian example does provide a model that could be followed by other countries, particularly in the region.
Well, I would be concerned about that, not least because Tunisia, to its great credit, has built a lot of civil society institutions and a history that means that this kind of an effort will be more fruitful. Okay, that's one. That doesn't necessarily exist in a lot of other countries in the Mediterranean, on both sides of the Mediterranean, actually. The second point to say is what I raised, which is I think we need to be a little bit critical of the role of these non-governmental organizations that were not democratically elected, that indeed for some Tunisians have a ambiguous or some even a problematic history, especially under the dictatorship decades, and that because the example has been set that once you get into a problem, you go outside of the parliament, you go outside of the transparency of the democratically elected government to try and solve your problems.
All right.
I'm concerned that that might create, in certain situations, a bad precedent.
Thank you. That was a wonderful minute. Thank you very much. Nicholas No in Tunisia, Christopher Thornton in Geneva, and Amina Zena also in Tunis. Thank you all very much indeed. And thank you, as ever, for watching Inside Story. You can leave your comments on the programme page of our website, aljazeera.com, or you can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can always tweet us at AJ Inside Story. Thank you for watching. From me and the whole team, it's bye for now.